Usually, when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of clinical precision.
Right, like it's supposed to feel like engineering.
Exactly. You break your radius, the X-ray shows this jagged white line cutting across the bone, and the doctor just points to the film and says, "There's the problem."
Yeah, it's binary, it's visible. It provides
Neat, actionable boxes.
But the moment we step into the world of dermatophytoses, superficial fungal infections, that comforting certainty just completely vanishes.
It really does. Welcome, by the way, to the learner who's joining us for another deep dive today. We're going to be navigating a diagnostic landscape that is honestly incredibly murky.
Yeah, you're dealing with an environment where the human body's inflammatory reaction to an invader can literally completely disguise the identity of the invader itself.
Which is wild. You think you're looking at one disease, but you're actually looking at a biological camouflage.
It really is the ultimate test of clinical mycology. I mean, you aren't just looking at the pathogen. You're looking at this dynamic, often chaotic battlefield between a highly specialized microorganism and the host's cellular immunity.
And today, we are diving right into that battlefield. We have a massive stack of source material. And to anchor our entire journey, we're going to dissect a single, highly specific medical board exam question.
Oh, yes, from the 2006 FewMark Dermatology exam.
Right, the FewMark. And the seemingly dry, decades-old, multiple-choice question about fungal infections actually holds the keys to understanding a microscopic world that is, well, equal parts fascinating and totally ruthless.
Using a rigorous board question is just a brilliant framework for us today. It forces us to synthesize anatomical geography, microbiological taxonomy, and even the physics of fluorescence all at once.
Yeah, so to get our heads around these fungi, which are technically called dermatophytes, we kind of need to abandon the idea of a passive infection.
Right, these aren't microbes just hitching a ride on your skin.
No, not at all. Think of dermatophytes as highly destructive, microscopic house guests. They don't just raid your fridge, they actually start systematically digesting the structural beams of your house.
Which is a great analogy because the beams in this scenario are keratin.
Right, that incredibly tough fibrous protein that forms the primary armor of your skin, your hair, and your nails.
And that structural piece is critical because keratin is not an easy protein to break down. I mean, it's packed with disulfide bonds.
It's basically biological concrete.
Exactly. Most organisms on Earth, including our own digestive enzymes, just cannot process it. These fungi possess this evolutionary superpower that allows them to unlock and consume our primary physical defense.
So to understand how these invaders operate, let's look at this 2006 FewMark question. It's a classic find the lie format. The examiners present 4 highly technical statements about dermatophytosis, and you, the candidate, have to identify the single incorrect statement.
Let's lay out the options we're working with. Let's see the trap they set.
Okay, so option A states that Tinea imbricata is caused by the fungus Trichophyton concentricum.
Okay, noted.
Option B claims that Trichophyton schonleini causes phases of the scalp, and upon examination with a whiz lamp, it presents a pink fluorescence.
Right.
Option C asserts that the dermatophytes most commonly causing onychomycosis belong to the generic Trichophyton and Epidermophyton. And finally, option D states that acarian is an acute inflammatory form of scalp tinea.
I mean, that is a gauntlet of a question. A dermatologist taking this exam has to instantly cross-reference clinical presentations, taxonomic classifications, and diagnostic tool outputs in real time.
Right, and I'm staring at option B, and something immediately stands out to me regarding those diagnostic tools. It mentions using a Woods lamp to look for a pink fluorescence on a patient's scalp.
Ah, the Woods lamp.
I mean, we are relying on ultraviolet black lights and glowing colors to dictate medical treatment. It feels like we're applying, 1990s nightclub aesthetics to clinical pathology.
I completely understand the skepticism, but the Woods lamp is foundational in dermatology. It's emitting long-wave ultraviolet radiation, usually peaking around 365 nanometers.
Okay, so it's a very specific wavelength.
Exactly, and when that specific wavelength hits certain microorganisms, it excites the electrons in their metabolic byproducts. When those electrons return to their ground state, they emit visible light.
Oh, wow. So it's a rapid, non-invasive way to detect specific biochemical signatures.
Right, like pteridines or porphyrins, which are produced by the pathogen.
So we are basically looking for the chemical exhaust of the fungus, and that exhaust glows a specific color. The doctor is essentially dusting for metabolic fingerprints.
That is the exact mechanism, and that specific mechanism is the hinge of the entire exam question.
All right, let's trigger the reveal then. The question asks us to identify the false statement. The lie hidden in this list is alternative B. Let's break down exactly why this sentence is such a trap.
Let's do it.
It reads, Trichophyton schonleini causes sphavis of the scalp, and upon examination with a Woods lamp, it presents a pink fluorescence.
You see, the test makers employed a really subtle psychological trick here. The first half of that statement is an absolute clinical truth.
Right, Trichophyton schonleini is the definitive agent for phavis.
Exactly. Tinea fovosa, which is this severe chronic scalp infection. They feed the candidate a verifiable fact to induce a false sense of security.
Oh, that's sneaky. They get you nodding along with the taxonomy and the disease state, so you completely gloss over the physics at the end. The trap is the color.
The trap is absolutely the color. If you turn off the clinic lights and illuminate a phavis infection with a 365 nanometer Woods lamp, you will not see pink.
What do you see?
The characteristic fluorescence of the pteridine compounds produced by Trichophyton schonleini is actually a distinct pale green or yellow green.
So they simply swap the color palette on the exam. But, test makers don't usually pull random colors out of thin air. If phavis glows green, the pink fluorescence must belong to a completely different pathogen. There has to be a pink imposter out there.
There is, and it's a famous one. A coral red or pink fluorescence under a Woods lamp is the classic diagnostic hallmark of erythrasma.
Erythrasma. Wait, that's not a fungus, is it?
No, it's an entirely different biological kingdom. Erythrasma is a superficial infection caused by a bacterium, Corynebacterium magnetissimum.
A bacterium?
Yeah, and this bacterium synthesizes copious amounts of coproporphyrin III. When UV light hits that specific porphyrin, it blasts back this vivid coral red glow.
So the examiners grafted the biochemical signature of a bacterial infection onto a fungal infection just to create the lie. Which brings us to the clinical consequences of getting this wrong in the real world, because you're the doctor in the room. Let's say a clinician's memory is foggy, they misinterpret the pink glow, and they diagnose a fungus instead of a bacteria.
Well, the consequences are total therapeutic failure. You're dealing with divergent cellular architectures.
Right, a fungus is a eukaryote, a bacterium is a prokaryote.
Exactly. So if you misinterpret that coral red glow and prescribe a topical antifungal agent, say, something that targets the fungal cell wall, it will have absolute zero efficacy against the peptidoglycan cell wall of Corynebacterium.
So the bacteria just ignores the medication and continues to proliferate. You have to match the pharmacological weapon to the correct biological kingdom.
Yes. The Woods lamp isn't just a party trick. It's the navigational beacon telling the physician which therapeutic pathway to take.
Which is why the source material emphasizes a core tenet. The clinic is sovereign. The laboratory confirms, but the physical exam, including the sensory and visual tools, dictates the initial approach.
Clinic is sovereign. I love that phrase.
Let's expand on that sovereignty. We've established what dermatophytes are generally. Let's get into the taxonomy. We're looking at 3 main genera responsible for this structural destruction.
Right. So in clinical mycology, dermatophytoses are caused by the genera Microsporum, Trichophyton, and Epidermophyton.
The unholy trinity of keratin eaters. And their primary weapon, the microscopic chainsaws they use to tear down the structural beams, are those keratinases we mentioned.
Yes.
You said earlier that keratin is packed with disulfide bonds, making it almost indestructible. How do these keratinases actually cut through that armor?
Well, keratinases are specialized metalloproteases, and while typical proteases just bounce off the dense cross-linked structure of keratin, dermatophytes secrete these specific enzymes alongside sulfite afflux pumps.
Sulfite pumps.
Yeah, the sulfites act as reducing agents, cleaving the rigid disulfide bridges. Once those bridges are broken, the keratin molecule unwinds, and that allows the keratinases to chop the protein into digestible peptides and amino acids.
Wait, they literally deploy a chemical softening agent to break the structural locks before they start digesting the protein. That is highly advanced biochemical warfare.
It really is. It's an elegant disruptive system.
Let's look at who is getting caught in this crossfire. The epidemiology in our sources reveals some really fascinating geographic and age-related patterns.
Oh, absolutely. We see a distinct shift in anatomical preference as humans age. For instance, tinea capitis, the infection of the scalp and hair follicles, is overwhelmingly a pediatric disease. It dominates in prepubertal children.
But as we grow up,
As we transition into adulthood, the epidemiology shifts downward to the extremities. Adults are primarily afflicted by tinea capitis, which is athlete's foot, and onychomycosis, the invasion of the nail plate.
so the house guests prefer the roof when we're young and the basement when we're older.
That's a great way to picture it.
We'll definitely dive into the specific endocrine reasons for that scalp immunity later because the mechanism is brilliant. But let's establish the environmental risk factors first. Fungi require a specific microclimate to thrive, right?
Yes, the necessary triad for fungal proliferation is warmth, darkness, and moisture. And human behavior often perfectly engineers this environment.
Like wearing closed shoes all day.
Exactly. Wearing occlusive footwear, like synthetic shoes with poor ventilation, creates a tropical microclimate right against the skin.
You are literally building a greenhouse for dermatophytes.
And then you introduce vectors of transmission. Communal locker rooms and public pools are notorious. You have a warm, humid environment where people are walking barefoot, shedding microscopic infected corneocytes, dead skin cells onto the wet tile.
Grace, but
And another major vector is contact with domestic animals.
that brings us to the etiology, the evolutionary origin of these fungi. The sources categorize them based on their preferred natural habitat. It's not a monolith, they have specific ecological niches.
Right, we divide them into three ecological groups: anthropophilic, zoophilic, and geophilic.
Okay, break those down for us.
Anthropophilic species have evolved to use humans as their primary reservoir. They are adapted to our specific biochemistry. Zoophilic species use animals as their primary hosts: cats, dogs, cattle.
And geophilic.
Geophilic species are essentially saprophytes. Their natural habitat is the soil, where they break down keratinous debris like shed hair or feathers that fall to the ground.
Here is where the evolutionary biology gets incredibly interesting. The source material outlines a striking clinical pattern based on these origins. When a human contracts an anthropophilic human-adapted fungus, the resulting infection is generally mild, chronic, and somewhat visually subdued.
Yes.
But if a human is infected by a zoophilic animal fungus or a geophilic soil fungus, our immune system launches an absolutely violent, explosive, inflammatory response.
It's a perfect demonstration of host-pathogen coevolution. Anthropophilic fungi have spent millennia adapting to human biology. They have a vested evolutionary interest in not triggering a massive immune response that would result in their eradication.
They want to stay under the radar.
Exactly. They downregulate their surface antigens. They are stealth pathogens, seeking to quietly consume keratin without waking the host's cellular defenses.
They want to eat the house without tripping the alarm system. But a fungus from a cow or the dirt doesn't have that stealth programming.
Not at all. They are biologically clumsy when they land on a human. A zoophilic or geophilic fungus expresses surface proteins and releases metabolic byproducts that our immune system immediately recognizes as profoundly foreign and highly dangerous.
And the body freaks out.
It detects this unfamiliar invader and immediately initiates a full-scale inflammatory war to purge it. They are noisy pathogens.
That gives clinicians a vital diagnostic heuristic. Intense inflammation usually points to an animal or soil source, whereas a quiet, scaling rash points to a human source.
Let's zoom in on that war zone, though. Let's look at the pathophysiology of the invasion. A spore lands on a human. What happens next?
The first critical step is adherence. The fungal arthrochonidia, the infectious spores, must anchor themselves to the corneocytes of the stratum corneum.
How do they hold on?
They use specialized surface glycoproteins called adhesins, which bind to receptors on the human cells. If they can't adhere, they're simply washed or shed away. But once anchored, they deploy the sulfite pumps and keratinases to breach the hull. When we look at how they attack hair specifically, the sources detail two primary invasion architectures, ectothrix and endothrix.
The prefixes dictate the geography of the invasion. In an ectothrix infection, the fungal hyphae, those branching filaments, proliferate and form a dense sheath around the exterior of the hair shaft. They envelop the structural beam.
Okay, and endothrix,
In endothrix invasion, the hyphae actually penetrate the cuticle of the hair and proliferate entirely inside the shaft, replacing the internal keratin matrix with fungal elements.
which brings us back to trichophyte and Schinleini, the agent of Favis from our exam question. It utilizes a highly specialized form of endothrix invasion. It doesn't just pack the inside of the hair with hyphae, it operates like a microscopic mining operation.
Yes, it creates an internal architecture characterized by tunneling. As T. Schinleini digests the internal keratin, it excavates distinct longitudinal air spaces within the hair shaft.
It's hollowing out the structural beams from the inside, leaving air pockets behind. That structural compromise has distinct clinical signs we'll cover in a bit, but I want to pivot back to that noisy immune response we talked about with animal fungi. The exam question mentioned a carrion in option D, defining it as an acute inflammatory form of scalp tinea. What is happening at a cellular level to create a carrion?
A carrion, or carrion celsi, is the clinical manifestation of a severe type IV delayed hypersensitivity reaction.
Okay, so what kicks that off?
The clumsy zoophilic antigens have been detected by Langerhans cells in the skin. These antigen-presenting cells migrate to the local lymph nodes and prime naive T cells.
So the immune system is building a highly specific targeted army.
Exactly. And because it takes time to prime and clone those T cells, the reaction is delayed. But once those activated T cells flood back into the scalp, they release a cascade of cytokines, primarily interferon gamma.
Which does what?
This triggers massive macrophage activation. The resulting clinical picture is a painful, heavily exudative, boggy granuloma.
The body essentially drops a metaphorical bomb on the infected hair follicles, liquefying the surrounding tissue just to destroy the fungus. And what about the physical presentation of Favis? Does T. Schinleini trigger a similar bomb?
Favis presents with a completely different yet equally severe morphology. The absolute hallmark of tinea fovosa is the formation of structures called scutula.
The sources describe scutula as dense cup-shaped crusts. What exactly are they made of?
They're essentially a concentrated biological landfill on the surface of the scalp. A scutulum is a dense, yellowish, concave mass consisting of an incredibly concentrated mat of fungal hyphae mixed with necrotic skin cells, dried exudate, and sebum.
Wow.
Yeah, these masses physically press down into the scalp, centering around the hair follicle, and they can coalesce into massive concrete-like plaques.
So carrion gives you a boggy, oozing granuloma, while Favis builds these dense fungal concrete cups. The ultimate impact on the patient isn't just cosmetic, is it? We aren't just dealing with an itchy scalp here.
No, the long-term consequence of both a severe carrion and chronic Favis is cicatricial alopecia.
Which is permanent, scarring hair loss.
Exactly. The intense type V inflammation of carrion, or the chronic physical compression and follicular destruction by the scutula in Favis, permanently obliterates the hair follicle stem cells. They are replaced by fibrotic scar tissue. The hair will never regenerate.
And the destruction extends to the nails as well. Onychomycosis isn't just an aesthetic issue of a discolored nail.
Right. It compromises the primary physical barrier of the distal extremity. The nail plate becomes hypertrophic, dystrophic, and friable. As the keratin is digested, the seal between the nail plate and the nail bed is broken.
Which opens a back door for far more dangerous pathogens. The sources explicitly mention that this fungal breaching of the barrier paves the way for severe bacterial complications.
This is a critical point of expanded clinical judgment. I mean, a dermatophyte infection rarely kills a patient, but by fracturing the skin barrier and creating fissures, it creates an entry portal for pathogenic bacteria like Streptococcus pyogenes or Staphylococcus aureus.
Oh, that's bad news.
Very. These bacteria can enter the deep dermal lymphatic vessels, causing erysipelas or severe cellulitis, these rapidly spreading, potentially life-threatening systemic infections.
So the fungus acts as the lockpick, and the bacteria kicks the door down. We've established how destructive they are. Now let's explore how clinicians actually track them down. We discussed the Woods lamp, but what is the foundational laboratory approach?
The absolute gold standard, like the first step in the diagnostic algorithm, is the direct mycological exam, or EMD. This relies on the chemical properties of potassium hydroxide, or KOH.
Let's look at the chemistry of the KOH prep. A doctor scrapes some scales from a patient's lesion, places them on a glass slide, and adds a drop of potassium hydroxide. What is happening on that slide?
It's selective destruction. Potassium hydroxide is a potent alkali. Human cell membranes are made of phospholipid bilayers, and our skin cells are packed with keratin.
Right.
The high pH of the KOH rapidly saponifies the lipids and denatures the human proteins, effectively dissolving the keratinocytes into a clear liquid.
It just melts the human tissue. But why does it melt melt the fungus?
Because the fungal cell wall is constructed from chitin, the same tough biopolymer found in the exoskeletons of insects and various glucans. Chitin is highly resistant to alkaline hydrolysis.
Oh, wow.
So the KOH clears away all the human cellular debris, leaving the fungal architecture starkly visible against a clean background under the microscope.
And when the clinician looks at that microscope, what specific architecture are they searching for to confirm a dermatophyte?
They are looking for septate hyaline hyphae. Hyphae are the long filamentous structures of the fungus. Septate means these filaments are divided by cross walls, or septa, making them look somewhat like hollow bamboo.
And hyaline?
Hyaline indicates they lack dark pigmentation, so they appear clear or translucent.
So finding translucent bamboo-like filaments confirms you have a fungus. But the KOH prep doesn't give you a name tag, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't differentiate between microsporum and trichophyton.
Exactly. To identify the specific etiologic agent, you must perform a culture. You inoculate the sprayed material onto a specialized nutrient medium, classically saborod dextrose agar.
Why saborod agar specifically? Why not just use standard petri dish food?
Well, saborod agar is specifically formulated with a low pH, usually around 5.6. This acidic environment inhibits the growth of most environmental bacteria, which prefer a neutral pH, while allowing the acid-tolerant fungi to thrive.
Ah, clever.
The clinician observes the macroscopic colony morphology, the color, texture, and growth rate, and then examines the microscopic spores, the macroconidia and microconidia, to definitively name the species.
And this taxonomic identification isn't just academic. If the culture grows a zoophilic species like Microsporum canis, the clinician immediately knows the therapeutic intervention has to extend beyond the patient.
Yes, they have to interrogate the patient's environment to find the infected animal reservoir, or the patient will just be reinfected the moment they go home. It guides the entire epidemiological intervention.
Let's expand our Woods lamp cheat sheet a bit. We know T. Schoenleini glows pale green, and the bacterial imposter erythrasma glows coral red. The sources mention the Microsporum genus as well. What is their specific output?
Species within the Microsporum genus, which are frequent culprits in pediatric Tinea capitis, produce a very distinct, brilliant emerald green fluorescence under the UV light.
So a much more vivid, intense green than the pale fluorescence of Favis.
Exactly.
But diagnosis isn't limited to microscopes and UV wavelengths. The source material highlights the visceral, sensory aspects of clinical mycology. Certain infections generate highly specific odors. We briefly touched on the smell of Favis earlier.
Tinea favosa is notorious for its olfactory signature. The dense accumulation of the scutula, combined with the specific volatile organic compounds produced by T. Schoenleini metabolism, creates an intense odor universally described in medical literature as the smell of a mouse nest.
A mouse nest. It's not just a generic foul smell, it is specifically musty, damp, and rodent-like. It's a striking example of a pathogen producing a highly specific aromatic profile. And visually, we have the carrion. The text uses a very specific metaphor to describe the physical appearance of that inflammatory granuloma.
They refer to the sieve sign. Because the violent type 5e inflammation is localized around the hair follicles, the swollen, boggy plaque becomes punctuated with multiple dilated, gaping follicular orifices.
And those gaping holes are actively exuding purulent material.
Yes. The surface of the scalp literally resembles a sieve or a honeycomb oozing pus. It is a visual testament to the sheer destructive power of the host's own cellular immune response.
Which brings us to the most critical aspect of expanded clinical judgment, the danger of misinterpreting these signs. We talked about how these fungi can disguise themselves. What happens if a physician looks at a scaling red lesion, decides it's just a localized eczema or contact dermatitis, and prescribes a standard topical corticosteroid?
Well, that specific misstep creates a disastrous clinical entity known as tinea incognito.
Fungal infection in disguise. Walk us through the pharmacology of that disaster.
Corticosteroids are potent immunosuppressants. When applied topically, they rapidly inhibit the local cell-mediated immune response. They shut down the production of inflammatory cytokines and suppress macrophage activity.
The redness fades, the itching stops, and the patient thinks the medication is a miracle cure.
But you have essentially turned off the perimeter defense system. The fungus is no longer restricted by the host's inflammation. The steroid acts as an immunological fertilizer, allowing the dermatophyte to hyperproliferate.
Oh, that's terrible.
It penetrates deeper into the tissue, spreads over a vastly larger surface area, and crucially, it loses its classic annular ring-like appearance.
It sheds its visual identity.
It becomes incognito. By the time the patient realizes the infection is worsening and sees another doctor, the clinical presentation is so atypical that diagnosing a primary fungal infection becomes incredibly difficult.
That perfectly illustrates the stakes. Let's pivot back to our few mark exam question. We spent all that time proving alternative B was the trap, but let's mind the other three options for their clinical truths. Alternative A stated, Tinea imbricata is caused by Trichophyton concentricum.
Tinea imbricata is arguably the most visually spectacular of all the dermatophytoses. It is caused exclusively by Trichophyton concentricum.
What does it look like?
Unlike a standard ringworm that forms a single angular lesion, T. concentricum induces the formation of massive, overlapping concentric scaly rings that can cover large portions of the torso and limbs.
The name itself is a perfect descriptor. Imbricata means overlapping like the terracotta tiles on a roof. The epidemiology of this specific fungus is entirely unique, isn't it?
It is remarkably geographically restricted. While most dermatophytes are ubiquitous, Tinea imbricata is endemic only to very specific isolated populations.
Like where?
We see it primarily in the South Pacific Islands, parts of Southeast Asia, and among certain isolated indigenous populations in the Amazon basin of Brazil. Susceptibility appears to be strongly linked to a specific autosomal dominant genetic trait within these populations.
An evolutionary niche where a specific human genotype and specific fungal phenotype are locked together. Amazing. Moving to alternative C, the dermatophytes that most commonly cause onychomycosis are from the genera Trichophyton and Epidermophyton.
This is an epidemiological certainty. While Microsporum prefers hair, Trichophyton and Epidermophyton absolutely dominate the nail plate, and within that group, one single species reigns supreme globally.
The undisputed heavyweight champion of the human foot.
Trichophyton rubrum. T. rubrum is an anthropophilic masterclass in stealth evasion. It causes the vast majority of onychomycosis and tinea pedis worldwide.
How does it stay so hidden?
Its cell wall structures are perfectly adapted to evade recognition by the human immune system, allowing it to establish lifelong chronic infections in the keratin of the feet and nails without triggering the noisy inflammation that would lead to its clearance.
And finally, alternative B carrion is a form of scalp tinea of acute evolution that presents with a strong inflammatory reaction. We've extensively covered the cellular mechanics of that type IV bomb, confirming it as a true statement. Now, I want to delve deeper into the structural engineering failures caused by these fungi. The source material outlines an anatomo-topographic approach. We discussed the endothrix invasion earlier, the fungus tunneling inside the hair. The text notes this creates a specific visual presentation called black dot tinea capitis. Explain the physics behind that.
It's pure structural sabotage. As the endothrix hyphae and spores pack the internal matrix of the hair shaft, they digest the internal keratin struts. The hair loses all tensile strength.
It just becomes hollowed out.
Exactly. It becomes so deeply compromised that normal friction, or even the weight of the hair itself, causes it to fracture.
It snaps. But where exactly does it break?
It fractures perfectly flush with the surface of the scalp, right at the follicular ostium. The entire shaft above the skin is lost, but the root remains embedded in the follicle, completely packed with dark fungal elements and debris.
So when a clinician examines the scalp, they don't see hair. They see a landscape of tiny, distinct black dots filling the follicular openings.
The structural columns have collapsed into their foundations.
Let's look at how the infection physically moves across the flat planes of the skin. The sources describe a centrifugal spread.
Fungi require a constant supply of unexploited keratin. When a spore establishes a colony, it exhausts the local nutrients at the center of the infection. To survive, the hyphae must grow radially outward, constantly seeking fresh keratin.
It operates exactly like a slow-moving forest fire. The fuel in the center is exhausted and smoldering, but the perimeter is a wall of active flames.
That is precisely the dynamic. The center of a classic tinea lesion often shows central clearing. The skin looks relatively normal, perhaps with some post-inflammatory hyperpigmentation, but the fungal load is minimal.
But the edges.
The active battlefield is the advancing erythematous raised scaly border. That is where the keratines are actively digesting tissue and where the immune system is actively fighting back.
This gives us a massive, actionable clinical rule. If you are going to perform that KOH prep we discussed, where must you scrape?
You must scrape the active advancing border. If you take your sample from the cleared center, you will likely harvest only dead corneocytes and exhausted hyphae, resulting in a false negative. The viable replicating fungus is entirely concentrated at the flaming perimeter.
Scrape the active border. So actionable. Let's talk about anatomical defenses. We noted earlier that tinea capitis is a childhood disease.
Yeah.
Why does the scalp suddenly become immune to these pathogens when a child hits puberty? What changes?
This is one of the most elegant biochemical defenses in human physiology. In a prepubertal child, the sebaceous glands on the scalp are relatively quiescent. The biochemical environment is highly hospitable to dermatophyte colonization.
The environment is essentially neutral, but puberty introduces a massive systemic hormonal shift.
Right. The surge in androgens during puberty drastically upregulates the activity of the sebaceous glands, triggering massive production of sebum. But it's not just the volume of oil, it's the specific chemical composition.
What's in it?
Adult sebum is extremely rich in medium-chain and long-chain fatty acids.
And how do those fatty acids interact with the fungus?
They are inherently fungostatic. These specific fatty acids interfere with the fungal cell membrane integrity and inhibit their metabolic pathways.
Oh, wow.
The onset of puberty literally saturates the scalp in a continuously renewing natural antifungal shield. This biochemical shift is so profound that many mild cases of childhood tinea capitis will spontaneously resolve as the patient enters adolescence.
The endocrine system manufactures its own localized therapy. But when our natural defenses fail, we have to intervene therapeutically. How do we actually poison these house guests without poisoning the host?
The therapeutic approach is dictated entirely by the anatomical depth of the invasion. We utilize two main strategies, topical and systemic. Topical agents, creams, ointments, lacquers are applied directly to the stratum corneum. Drugs like terbinafine or clotrimazole.
What is the mechanism of action there?
Terbinafine, for example, is an allylamine. It inhibits an enzyme called squalene epoxidase in the fungal cell wall synthesis pathway. This causes a toxic buildup of squalene inside the fungus, leading to cell death.
And it works well on the surface.
Yes, topicals are highly effective for dermatophytosis on glabrous, hairless skin like the torso or the soles of the feet because the drug can easily penetrate the thin layer of dead skin and bathe the superficial hyphae.
But I imagine a cream is utterly useless if the fungus has tunneled deep inside a hair follicle or buried itself deep within the nail matrix. Wiping a cream on the surface is like trying to put out a fire inside the walls by washing the wallpaper.
That is the exact anatomical limitation. Topicals cannot penetrate deep enough into the follicular apparatus or through the dense hypertrophic keratin of an infected nail. For tinea capitis and onychomycosis, topical monotherapy is destined for failure.
So we have to deliver the fumigant through the internal plumbing. We use systemic therapy.
We use oral antifungal agents. Drugs like rizufulvin, oral terbinafine, or itraconazole. These medications are absorbed through the GI tract, enter the systemic circulation, and are delivered directly to the highly vascularized base of the hair follicle and the nail matrix.
And how does grisafulvin, for instance, actually stop the fungus once it gets there?
Rizufulvin operates entirely differently than the topicals. It doesn't attack the cell wall, it is fungostatic. Once inside the fungal cell, it binds tightly to tubulin, interfering with microtubule function. This completely arrests the fungal cell during metaphase, halting mitosis. The fungus can no longer divide.
And crucially, the drug binds to the newly forming keratin in the human host. So as the hair or the nail grows outward from the base, it is already saturated with the poison. It grows out pre-fortified against the infection. But wait, I noticed a wild therapeutic paradox in the source material regarding the treatment of the carrion.
Ah, the carrion paradox. It requires very careful clinical navigation.
Let's lay it out. The carrion is the most violent, explosive, severe fungal infection of the scalp. It's a massive inflammatory bomb. Yet the sources indicate that alongside oral antifungals, a clinician might prescribe a short course of systemic corticosteroids. Wait, we just spent a whole segment detailing how steroids cause tinea and capitis by acting as fertilizer for the fungus. Why would you give an immunosuppressant to the worst fungal infection possible?
It seems like malpractice on the surface, I know, but it's actually advanced damage control. You have to understand what is actually causing the permanent damage in a carrion. It is not the trichophyton or the microsporum destroying the hair follicle.
It's the host's own immune system.
Exactly. The type AV hypersensitivity reaction is so overwhelming that the localized cytokine storm and macrophage activity will permanently liquefy the follicular stem cells.
Oh, wow.
If you only administer an oral antifungal, the drug takes weeks to fully halt the fungal replication. During those weeks, the immune system continues to drop bombs. By the time the fungus is finally eradicated, the scalp is permanently scarred and barren.
The immune system burns the house down just to kill the spider. So the steroids act as a ceasefire.
A highly strategic temporary ceasefire. The short burst of oral steroids aggressively suppresses the destructive cellular inflammation, saving the architecture of the hair follicles. It gives the slower acting oral antifungal the critical time it needs to systemically saturate the tissue and neutralize the pathogen safely.
You use the dangerous drug to stop the friendly fire, just long enough for the targeted poison to work. That is brilliant. Let's talk about the timeline for treating the nails, because the text emphasizes that patience isn't just helpful, it's biologically mandatory. Why does treating onychomycosis require a staggering 3 to 12 months of daily medication?
The timeline is dictated by the kinetics of human keratin production. The antifungal drugs cannot restore or heal the existing dystrophic nail plate. The thick, yellow, crumbly keratin is dead tissue, the damage is permanent.
So you aren't fixing the old nail?
Not at all. The systemic medication simply saturates the nail matrix to ensure that the new keratin being produced is entirely free of fungal elements. Therefore, the therapeutic endpoint isn't when the fungus is dead. The endpoint is when the body has physically grown a completely new, pristine nail plate from the proximal cuticle all the way to the distal edge of the toe, pushing the old infected nail entirely off the foot.
And toenails are notoriously slow builders.
They grow at an average rate of about 1 millimeter per month. Replacing the entire plate of a hallux of big toe takes 9 to 12 months.
So if a patient stops the systemic therapy at month 4 because the proximal half looks clear,
the residual fungus residing in the distal dead nail will simply march backward and reinfect the new growth.
You have to maintain the chemical shield until the compromised structure is entirely evacuated from the body. Okay, we've explored the human biology extensively. I want to shift our focus to the zoonotic aspects. The source material has a fascinating section linking human pathology to specific animals. We were talking about interspecies transmission.
Zoonosis provides incredible insights into evolutionary adaptation and host immunity. Let's examine the primary vectors.
First on the list is the domestic cat, Felis catus. The text identifies the cat as the primary reservoir for the dermatophyte microsporum canis.
Right, despite the specific epithet canis, which implies a canine host, felines are the primary carriers. And here's the evolutionary brilliance of M. canis. It has achieved a state of near perfect commensalism with the cat.
So they live in harmony.
Yes. The fungus heavily colonizes the feline fur and stratum corneum, but it rarely triggers a robust inflammatory response. The cat is frequently entirely asymptomatic. No alopecia, no erythema, no itching.
The fungus survives by not alarming its host. But then a human child interacts with the cat.
A child buries their face in the kitten's fur. The arthrocanidia are mechanically transferred to the child's scalp. But the human immune system lacks that evolutionary truce. It immediately identifies the zoophilic antigens of M. canis as a high-level threat.
The alarm bells ring.
The result is a severe, highly inflammatory tinea capitis and frequently a carrion.
The silent feline carrier triggers an immunological explosion in the human. Next on the zoonotic list, the European hedgehog, Erinaceus europaeus. The sources state they carry trichophyton erinaceae.
This is a remarkable ecological niche. Trichophyton erinaceae has adapted to live specifically among the dense keratin spines of the hedgehog. Again, the host animal tolerates the colonization without significant pathology.
But if a human handles that hedgehog?
The transmission mechanism here is uniquely mechanical. If a person handles a colonized hedgehog without protective gloves, the sharp, rigid spines create microscopic lacerations in the human epidermis, physically inoculating the fungal spores deep into the stratum corneum of the hands.
It's literally an automatic injection system.
And because it's a completely novel zoophilic antigen, the human immune immune system mounts an aggressive defense, resulting in a severely inflammatory tinea manuum, a localized blistering fungal infection of the hands.
A perfect demonstration that a fungus adapted to a spine causes absolute chaos in human skin. Finally, we look at the bovine reservoir. Cows, Bos tauruses, are carriers of trichophyton varicosum.
This specific transmission pathway creates a recognized occupational disease known as farmer's tinea or cattle ringworm. It heavily afflicts farm workers, large animal veterinarians, and anyone in close physical contact with infected calves or adult cattle.
And sticking to our heuristic, because it's a cow fungus, the human reaction is not going to be subtle.
It is intensely noisy. Trichophyton varicosum induces deep, highly painful, heavily crusted, and suppurative inflammatory plaques, typically localized to the exposed areas of the workers, the forearms, the neck, and the face.
It's an interspecies biological war zone. I want to step away from the farm now and look at the history of science. The source material draws a direct line from these seemingly mundane skin conditions to 3 separate Nobel laureates. It shows how foundational the study of dermatophytes was to the very creation of modern microbiology.
The historical context is crucial here. The methodology required to understand fungi literally paved the way for our understanding of all infectious diseases.
Let's start with Robert Koch, who won the Nobel Prize in 1905. He is legendary for his work on tuberculosis and anthrax. How does his legacy connect to athlete's foot?
Well, Koch didn't specifically research dermatophytes, but he invented the fundamental tools of the trade. Prior to Koch, scientists struggled to isolate specific microbes because they grew them in liquid broths, creating confusing mixed populations.
It's just a microbial soup.
Exactly. Koch developed the revolutionary technique of using solid media, initially potato slices, then gelatin, and finally agar, to isolate individual bacterial colonies and prove they cause specific diseases.
He created the physical staging ground for microbiology.
And a brilliant French dermatologist named Raymond Saboureau recognized the power of Koch's solid media. Saboureau, who is universally recognized as the father of modern medical mycology, took Koch's methods, modified the agar to make it acidic and sugar-rich, and used it to systematically isolate, culture, and mathematically classify the dermatophytes in the late 1800s.
Koch built the laboratory framework. Saboureau used it to map the fungal kingdom. That is a phenomenal connection. Next on the Nobel list is Paul Ehrlich, who won in 1908 for his foundational work in immunology.
Ehrlich was a visionary who sought to explain how the body chemically recognized and neutralized toxins and pathogens. He developed the side chain theory, which was the conceptual precursor to our modern understanding of antibodies and cellular receptors.
How does that apply to our house guest?
When we dissect the pathology of the carrion, when we describe Langerhans cells presenting antigens to T cells, and the resulting highly specific localized immune explosion, we are entirely reliant on the theoretical framework of cellular immunity that Paul Ehrlich established. He provided the vocabulary and the conceptual mechanics to explain why the host immune system drops the bomb.
He mapped the friendly fire. The final Nobel laureate connected to this topic is perhaps the most famous figure in medical history, Alexander Fleming, who won the prize in 1945 for the discovery of penicillin. How does the discovery of the first antibiotic relate to fungal infections?
Fleming's discovery fundamentally shifted how humanity approached pharmacology. He observed antibiosis, the phenomenon where one microorganism secretes chemical weapons to suppress or kill a competing microorganism. Penicillin is an antibacterial compound naturally produced by a mold, a penicillium fungus.
Fungi producing chemicals to kill bacteria.
Exactly. This realization ignited a global, frantic search for other microbial weapons. Researchers began systematically screening molds and fungi to see what other chemical toxins they were producing. In 1939, researchers isolated a secondary metabolite from a different species of mold, Penicillium grisafulvum.
And what did that do?
This specific compound didn't kill bacteria, it arrested the mitosis of other fungi.
Grisafulvin, the systemic oral antifungal we discussed earlier for treating deep hair and nail infections.
Yes, grisafulvin was the first systemic antifungal agent ever discovered, and its clinical introduction was nothing short of a medical miracle, largely because of what it replaced.
Yeah, the source material mentions the therapeutic protocols utilized before grisafulvin. It references something called X-ray depilation. Give us the historical context there, because it sounds, well, barbaric.
It was an era of medical desperation. Before 1939, severe endothrix infections of the scalp, particularly tinea fufosa, were functionally incurable. The fungal elements resided deep within the follicular matrix where no topical salve or ointment could reach. The disease caused relentless suffering and permanent scarring baldness. The medical community realized that the only way to eradicate the deep-seated fungus was to physically remove the entire infected hair shaft from the follicle.
To pull the structural beam entirely out of the foundation.
Yes, and manually plucking thousands of hairs from a child's inflamed scalp was impossible. So doctors turned to the newly discovered technology of ionizing radiation. They developed the Adamson-Kinbuck technique.
How did that work?
A child with severe scalp ringworm would have their head divided into precise geometric quadrants. Doctors would then expose the child's cranium to carefully calibrated overlapping fields of raw X-ray radiation.
Oh my God.
The ionizing radiation intentionally targeted and temporarily destroyed the rapidly dividing matrix cells of the hair follicles, inducing a massive antigen effluvium.
They used targeted radiation poisoning to force the hair to fall out.
It caused total temporary baldness. As the irradiated hairs fell out of the follicles, they carried the deep-seated fungal spores out with them, effectively curing the infection.
It cured the fungus, but at what cost to the child?
The long-term costs were devastating. Decades later, epidemiological studies on these cohorts of irradiated children revealed terrifying collateral damage. The exposure to the ionizing radiation significantly increased their lifelong risk of developing basal cell carcinomas on the scalp, thyroid cancers, and severe meningiomas tumors of the brain lining.
They traded a severe scalp infection for a lifelong risk of brain tumors.
That is the grim reality of pre-modern medicine, and that is why the discovery of grisafulvin, born directly from Fleming's conceptual breakthrough with penicillin, was revolutionary. An oral pill derived from bread mold could travel through the bloodstream, halt the fungal mitosis from the inside, and safely cure the infection without relying on dangerous radiation.
It closed the darkest chapter in dermatological therapeutics. That context really changes everything. It elevates a simple pill to a profound historical milestone. We've covered an immense expanse of biology and history today. Let's pull everything together. Let's do a rapid-fire synthesis of the key points and exam tips for anyone preparing for the boards or just wanting to solidify this deep dive.
Let's lock in some classic clinical associations. The sources highlight the 2 hands and 1 foot syndrome.
What drives that specific asymmetrical presentation?
It is the classic signature of trichophyton rubrum. A patient presents with extensive chronic dermatophytosis on the palmar surfaces of both hands, but only on the plantar surface of 1 foot, or conversely, both feet and 1 hand.
Why only one?
It occurs through chronic autoinoculation. The patient harbors the primary infection on 1 foot, and they habitually use their dominant hand to excoriate or scratch the lesion over years, eventually implanting the stealthy T rubrum into the keratin of both hands.
So the asymmetrical pattern is literally a map of the patient's scratching habits. Incredible. Another major clinical pearl, the systemic signs of the carrion.
Always check the lymph nodes. The carrion is not just a localized skin issue, it's a massive regional inflammatory event. The lymphatic system struggles to process the immense load of cellular debris and cytokines draining from the scalp.
Which leads to?
This results in pronounced cervical and occipital lymphadenopathy, swollen tender lymph nodes in the neck and the back of the head.
Next, let's deploy the memory trick provided in the text. There is a specific mnemonic to remember all the critical attributes of tinea fufosa using the word FAVUS itself, FAVUS. Break that down for us.
It's an incredibly efficient way to recall the data. F stands for fluorescence green, reminding you of the pale green woods lamp output. A is for the agent, Trichophyton chenleni. V is for vermelho, Portuguese for not red, which specifically guards against the erythrasma trap from our exam question. U represents Unidades favicas, the clinical term for the scutula, those dense cup-shaped crusts. And S stands for sujeira, Portuguese for filth, which serves as the olfactory trigger to remember the musty mouse nest odor.
F green, A gentiulini, V not red, U sucula cups, S mouse nest smell. That completely dismantles any board question about FAVUS. Let's finish the review with the definitive woods lamp cheat sheet.
Okay, a green fluorescence indicates a fungal pathogen, specifically the bright emerald of microsporum, or the pale green of T. chenleni. A coral red or pink fluorescence indicates a bacterial pathogen, specifically erythrasma, caused by Corynebacterium magnetissimum. And a yellow gold fluorescence points to a completely different superficial yeast infection called pityriasis versicolor, caused by Malassezia.
And the overarching behavioral rule for these pathogens, zoophilic and geophilic species, are noisy invaders causing massive inflammation, while anthropophilic species are quiet, highly adapted stealth pathogens.
Internalize those principles, and the murky waters of clinical mycology become highly navigable.
This has been an absolute masterclass. We took a dry 2006 exam question and unpacked a hidden world of biochemical chainsaws, immunological bombs, and interspecies warfare. But before we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with one final, deeply provocative thought. It's a physiological absolute buried in the correlated medical curiosity section of the source material.
It is perhaps the most profound limitation of these organisms.
We have spent an hour detailing how ruthlessly destructive dermatophytes are. They deploy radical they dissolve the rigid disulfide bonds of keratin, they hollow out hair shafts, destroy nails, and trigger massive granulomas. They seem biochemically unstoppable. Yet there is a hard biological boundary they cannot cross. Dermatophytes are utterly incapable of infecting deep living human tissues.
That's right.
They cannot invade your internal organs. They are permanently exiled to the dead, keratinized surfaces of your body. Why? What stops them from eating deeper?
They are halted by two insurmountable physiological barriers. The first is chemical human blood serum is rich in transferrin, a protein that tightly binds free iron. The fungi require iron to survive, and the serum effectively starves them of it.
Wow.
But the second and most absolute barrier is thermodynamic.
The temperature.
Dermatophytes have evolved to function optimally at temperatures between 25 and 30 degrees Celsius, the ambient temperature of the external environment and the relatively cool surface of the human epidermis. But the internal environment of the human body is tightly aggressively thermoregulated at 37 degrees Celsius or 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit.
They cannot survive the heat. I want you to ponder the magnitude of that mechanism. We navigate a world absolutely saturated with these keratin-devouring spores. They're in the soil we walk on, hiding in the fur of our pets, waiting on the tiles of the locker room. They're constantly landing on us, adhering to our skin, trying to deploy their enzymes to consume us. And the only reason we are not systematically digested from the inside out, the only reason these destructive house guests are trapped permanently on the roof in the siding, is the internal furnace we maintain every single second of our lives. Our 37-degree core body temperature acts as an invisible, impenetrable wall of fire that keeps the invaders completely at bay.
It is a profound testament to the aggressive balance of human physiology. We inadvertently provide the keratin they feed on, but our very metabolism generates the absolute thermodynamic limit to their invasion.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. I hope you look at the world around you, your pets, and the very surface of your skin with a newfound appreciation for the invisible, relentless biological battles happening right now. Battles held safely in check by the heat of your own blood. Stay curious, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.